Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the lightweight pulley installation series. In the previous video we took the car over to Rad Motorsport, threw it on the dyno, got a baseline of how much power the car is making with the OEM pulleys, and took it back here, removed the OEM pulleys, and so in this video we're going to go ahead and actually install the lightweight pulleys from Nonstop Tuning. In the previous video I mentioned that we won't be using the lightweight pulleys for the alternator, mainly because I was unable to remove the nut from the alternator shaft, and so in order to reduce the chances of not having an alternator, we're just going to go ahead and use the OEM pulley on the alternator. And so in this video we're just going to go ahead and jump in and start installing these brand new lightweight pulleys from Nonstop Tuning. So let's go. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the water pump. I'm going to go and install this guy first. So this one's relatively easy. There's the 3 bolts that go on the outside, and then it just goes like this, and we just torque it down. So really easy. Goes in just like that. Tight for now. I'm just going to go ahead and tighten these until they're all seated, and then I'll go ahead and torque them down. Okay, one more. Okay, so the actual torque spec on the water pump pulley is about 11 foot-pounds, which is basically non-existent. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to try and hand tighten it as tight as I can. Try my best to hold the water pump pulley in place while I try to basically hand tighten the 3 bolts that are holding on the pulley to the water pump assembly. Try and go from below. Usually this kind of gives me the best access right now. Here we go. One more. Okay. My water pump pulley is installed. Next one going in is the crankshaft. So we got the crankshaft pulley right here. So one thing to keep in mind when installing the crankshaft is there's a pin on the crankshaft itself, and that lines up with the hole you can see on the pulley itself. Right. So when you're installing this, make sure it lines up with the pin and just slide it in. Okay, seems like it's in. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and install the crankshaft bolt, but before we do that I'm just going to put a little bit of Loctite glue on this. See? And this just goes right in, and we're just going to thread it in by hand until it fully seats. I'm going to go ahead and take my tool that holds the pulley in place and put it in here. At the same time, I'm going to go ahead and send this, torque it down a little bit. Okay, So the crankshaft bolt gets torqued to 95 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and do it in increments using my lessons learned from my valve cover gasket replacement video. Instead of going all the way up to the required torque, I'm going to go in increments and slowly make my way up there. So I'm going to start off small. I'm just going to go to, set it at 30 pounds, 30 foot-pounds, just to be safe. Right, we'll just slowly work our way up to the 95 foot-pounds. So slowly. Okay, that's 30 foot-pounds. Oh, that was 50 foot-pounds actually, sorry. So that's 50, let's go up to 60 foot-pounds. 70 foot-pounds. 80 to 90. Alright, slowly make our way to 95. Let's go 92. 94. My torque wrench doesn't have 95, so we're going to go up to 96 foot-pounds. A little bit over, but that should be okay. Okay, that's 96 foot-pounds. That's pretty much good. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is go ahead and install the alternator back in. So like I mentioned, right, this nut didn't come loose, so we're just going to go ahead and reuse and reinstall it back into its old position using the old pulley. So this one's pretty simple. Just have this channel right here that slides into a block here. It just goes in. Just line it up. Then you have your bolt right here. So this is the bolt that holds the bottom one in. This just goes into place. Just gonna wiggle it. There we go. And you can just tighten this. Okay, so the last thing that goes on is this alternator adjustment bracket. Now, if you guys remember, I mentioned I was going to try and install this from Nonstop Tuning. The problem is, it's too loose. So, this bolt right here and the bolt that goes inside the alternator, this bolt right here, this bolt is actually undersized. And as you can see, there's a lot of play. And so, if I was to install this, also this part up here is hitting up against the engine block, and then this would essentially go like this. So ideally this would be the replacement of this guy. However, because there's so much play in it, you know, there's a chance that it can come loose. And so, and on top of that, if you look up here, there's barely enough, there's like no threads for me to put the nut on this side. Like there's nothing there, because this bolt is actually seated as part of the engine block. And so there's no way I can run a longer bolt than what's already installed. And so if I was to run this and flush this onto the engine block side and try to put this nut on the end, I don't have any threads. And if I do it backwards, maybe, but I have like maybe one thread of engagement, and that's about it. And so that's not, I don't feel comfortable with that. And same thing with this, right? This is not even fully seated, but look how much play there is with this. And so ideally what you would do with this is you would turn this turnbuckle. As you can see, it adjusts the alternator, right? And then usually you would have your belt over here that's all wrapped around, and you'll use this to adjust the how much tension is on the belt. And then likely same thing on the reverse here. To close it, you'll loosen it. So essentially that's what this is doing right here, is it's replacing this assembly, this little bracket, with a turnbuckle. But because these rod ends are essentially the wrong size, I will not be installing them. However, I will contact NST and see if we can maybe get a different size rod end for these two ends, because these diameters, inside diameters, do not match the outside diameter of these bolts, and so I would be very uncomfortable to run this on the car. And so I'm gonna hold off and contact NST and see if there's something we can do. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead and reinstall this existing OEM bracket. And so this one's really simple, right? This side goes here. You have a nut goes on this side, and then this one goes through this and threads into the alternator like that. And from here you'll loosen this, and you'll use this as a way to adjust the tension on the belt. Okay, so now before we go ahead and tighten these bolts for the alternator, we're going to go ahead and run the brand new belt that I bought. This is from Gates. This is correct size, and so that's the part number and everything. And so go ahead and get that out. Right, brand new belt, everything looks good. So we're gonna go ahead and run this belt through. And so just make sure you have, looking at the diagram, just make sure you run the belt in the correct orientation. For me, I'm running the AC compressor, so take a look at the diagram on the screen and make sure you just route the belt according to whichever configuration you have on your car. So I'm just going to go ahead and thread this down. There. Okay, so that goes there. This wraps around the water pump. Underneath the car now, just make sure you run the belt wherever it needs to run. So water pump, right? And then I have the AC compressor here. And crankshaft pulley on this side. So just make sure you route it accordingly. So just like that. And then I'm gonna go up and just adjust the alternator to give some tension on the belt. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start tightening some of these belts on the alternator, starting with the lower one. Give it a nice tug. Just going to go ahead, just use like a bar or whatever, pry up on the engine block, and then pry up against the alternator, and just go ahead and tighten this down. Okay. And just tighten this one down while you're at it. So now that everything is tightened, we're going to go ahead and torque it. I think the only one that really needs to be torqued is the bottom one, which is down here, which gets torqued to 40 foot-pounds. The rest, the other two, don't really get torqued that high. I mean, this one right here gets torqued to about 14 foot-pounds. And this one over here gets torqued to 8.1 foot-pounds, so it's not really that high. So I think those can just be hand tight. I think just the bottom one needs to be torqued to 40 foot-pounds. Try using a crow's foot. Okay, so that's 10 foot-pounds. We're gonna do it in increments: 20, 30 foot-pounds. Last one, 40. And these ones, we're just going to double check these are hand tight. Last thing to do Connect all the wires. And then there's a nut. Put back the cover. Kind of just snap into place. And last one, this connector down here, it goes into the front. Last thing to do is connect the negative terminal of the battery. You can go ahead and fire up the engine. Okay, moment of truth, here we go. Okay, idling around 700 RPM. Temperature of the engine is about 179, 180. Just monitoring. Battery seems to be charging. It's getting 13.9 volts. Engine temp is rising a little bit, so I'm just monitoring it. Just kind of letting it run. Also because the throttle body has to adjust itself because I disconnected the battery. But right now I'm just monitoring everything. So that's pretty much it for the pulley installation. Now we're going to go ahead and take the car back over to Rad Motorsport, throw it back on the dyno, and see just how many horsepower we actually made with these lightweight pulleys. So onto the dyno. Okay, so after looking at the dyno charts, it's hard to say whether or not these pulleys actually made a difference. I mean, it's clear I made less horsepower than with the OEM pulleys, and so it's really hard to justify if these pulleys are worth it. One thing that may have contributed to the less horsepower could have been the air temperature, the ambient air temperature at which had the car on the dyno. I did have the car on the dyno 2 separate days, mainly due to scheduling conflicts with trying to get a slot onto the dyno. There's a lot of other people that were trying to use the dyno as well. The 2 days that I did the dyno runs were separate from each other, but I did my best to try and schedule the second set of runs as close as possible to mimic the conditions of the first run. But like I said, the conditions and the availability of getting onto the dyno was very hard with the vendor. And so, that could have been one thing that contributed as to why I had less horsepower than before. Another contributing factor that may have affected the results of having less horsepower actually could have been the dyno itself. They did mention that there was a software update to their dyno since my initial runs, and so that could have contributed as to why I made less horsepower. Maybe the software was calibrated a little differently now, and it read the dyno a little differently. That may have contributed to the less horsepower reading on the second set of runs. So that might have been another contributing factor. And the last thing that may have contributed to the actual results of the less horsepower, maybe just the components themselves. I did use a brand new belt after removing the OEM belt from the assembly. It could have been the pulleys themselves, even though I didn't see any defects when I initially inspected them. And so it could just be a multiple of things that, a combination of all this just contributed to less reading on the dyno, and resulting in less horsepower, less torque, and everything. And it's hard to say if these made any difference as far as performance wise. Looking at it from the numbers point of view and just pure data, it doesn't look like it improved anything. But on the driving side, when I was driving the car around, it felt like it did improve. The throttle response did feel a little better, and the car did feel better driving it around. And so driving wise, I feel like it made a difference. Not a huge difference, but a slight difference to the point where it's enough to feel something. And it's hard to say because it wasn't a significant increase in performance, right, according to the data. And so it's hard to say. It could be like a placebo effect, to where since I know that the pulleys are lighter, I'm thinking that something is affecting the engine. But it's hard to correlate the two when one doesn't back up the other. And so take it with a grain of salt, the data that I recorded and gathered. But as far as what I'm feeling, it does feel a little better. The car feels a little bit more responsive, and it's quicker to get up to speed and everything. And so, we'll have to continue driving around with the pulleys on, and I just gotta get used to the pulleys and the new belt, and I keep adjusting the belt as well. I'll keep it on until the next autocross event, and maybe at autocross will it really make a difference. And so we'll have to wait till then. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention is, so I already mentioned that I didn't install the alternator pulley because I couldn't get it off. So, yeah, I don't know how much of a difference this would have made, but, if I ever get a new alternator, I will definitely install this pulley on it. But as far as the alternator bracket, I contacted Nonstop Tuning about this and was trying to get more information about these because these rod ends are actually different sizes. They are the inner diameter of these rod ends are bigger than the bolts that are on the engine block itself and for the alternator. And so I tried contacting them, trying to work it out with them, but they said that it's worked on every vehicle. And I don't know if that's true or not, because it clearly doesn't work on my car, even though it's advertised for the Toyota Yaris, the 1NZ Toyota Yaris, which I do have. And so I thought about possibly buying brand new rod ends. The only thing that would be hard, that would make this difficult to reuse, is actually the threads on the inside of this turnbuckle. And so if I was to order the proper size rod ends to utilize this, it would have to be a custom made rod end, because these threads are common threads, and the inner threads of the turnbuckle are matched to this, right? And so it would have to be custom made. And so the rod ends, if I was to order brand new ones, would not work with this turnbuckle essentially. And so that would render this whole thing pretty much useless at this point. And so I don't know yet what I'm going to do with the turnbuckles and the alternator bracket. I may end up just returning them, because honestly it really doesn't matter at this point. That'll make it a lot easier to adjust the alternator, but obviously it's not going to work out. So yeah. Okay guys, so that's pretty much it for this two-part video series on the lightweight pulleys from Nonstop Tuning. So like I mentioned previously, it's hard to say whether or not these pulleys are actually worth the investment. As we saw in the dyno charts, it really didn't make a difference as far as performance wise and number wise, but as far as, you know, driving and how it feels when I drive it, it made a slight difference. And so just know that if you do decide to get these pulleys installed in your car, your results and your experience may differ from mine. And so just take extreme care when it comes to installing the pulleys and any additional accessories. If you don't feel comfortable installing them yourselves, you know, take it to a reputable mechanic or a shop that you can trust to install it, and also dyno your car if you decide to try and see if you get any gains, horsepower gains or torque gains from these pulleys. And so hopefully you found the information in this video helpful, whether it was about the pulleys themselves, installation and disassembly of the pulleys, or even just the dyno charts in general. Hopefully you found it informational. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions, and I'll try my best to get back to you guys. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Shoots!